Heartfelt conversations can change the world. Here's the Epic Kate podcast.
No one can ever truly comprehend losing a child. And I think it's really important to grow in compassion and understanding for hearing a perspective about that.
Where I get slowed down is probably about 500 yards from the exit, and I'm just inching along at this point. And throughout this whole time, I'm snapping my fingers at my son because he looks like he's fading in and out, like someone who gets a concussion. You don't want him to fall asleep. That's kind of my thinking at this point. I'm just like, buddy, stay with me, stay with me, stay with me. I don't know what's going on. Just stay with me. And in my head, I'm freaking out at this point because I don't know what's going on, and it looks like it's getting serious to me.
It was really wonderful to talk with Jason about his journey of finding out that he would become a parent of children with special needs, and talking about the specialness and the happy times with his son who passed away, and how he's using his death to be a light to other men in dealing with their grief, and how it's just led to him becoming a very prolific writer and connector online. Hello, and welcome to the Epic Kate podcast. I'm so thankful to have this guest, Jason, here. This is going to be probably a pretty heavy conversation. I got my tissues here. This conversation is about loss and grief and moving and how life changes from that. So I'm happy to introduce Jason, let Jason have a chance to introduce himself. So go ahead for that.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on your podcast. You're my first international podcast, so I'm thrilled to be here, all the way from across the pond from you. My name is Jason Tuttle. I am a married father, been married 20 plus years. I have two kids with multiple physical and mental disabilities that kind of thrust us into the special needs world about 18 years ago. In that time, we have lived in and out of the hospital. We have done multiple specialist doctors visits. We've done multiple hospital stays. We've done anything you can think of as it relates to special needs, up until, unfortunately, my son passed away approximately 2 years ago. My daughter's still alive and well, ornery as ever. She's 15, although she functions about 5 or 6 years old. She's 15, and honestly going on about 40 right now with her teenage behavior at this point. So that's kind of my life in a nutshell at this point.
Oh, well, thank you so much for coming on and wanting to that's such an important theme to me, is, making a difference through your story, because our stories matter and they can reach other people where they are, and people can feel less alone. People can learn compassion. Can you share a bit about what life was like in discovering that you were going to have a really different kind of life with children that needed a lot more?
Well, when I met my wife, for those of us in the States, I'm essentially from the South. She's up in the Northeast, up in the kind of the Massachusetts, Connecticut area. Her father is the very typical what you think of someone from Massachusetts, kind of Boston, very upfront kind of family that I married into. And initially, my wife, who came from a big family, wanted 4 children. And I've always wanted children, but my first response was, let's have the first one, then let's talk. We'll go from there. And so we had no reason to believe that we were going to have kids with medical needs. We got married. About a year after we got married, we decided we were going to start trying. Everything was working out fine throughout the pregnancy. And then we got to that week 20 appointment where, everybody wants to know the sex of the child. And initially we were playful about it because I'm a planner. I was the one that I put together the nursery. So I didn't necessarily want to do the greens and yellows. I wanted to do either, traditionally boy, traditionally girl, that kind of thing. And so we played back and forth. She didn't want to know because she was of the mindset, well, this is the last great surprise you can have in life. And so we went back and forth on it while we were in that appointment. And about halfway through, the tech that was doing the ultrasound said, well, we're at this point. Do you want to know the sex of the child? And so we playfully go back and forth. And she goes, well, I've found an issue. I need to know the sex of the child. And at that point, we went, what's the sex of the child? And she said, well, you're having a boy. And we said, well, what's the issue? And she goes, well, I can't officially tell you because I'm the tech. She said, the doctor will have to legally tell you. And at that point, that really piqued our interest. And so I said, well, what's the difference between boy and girl? She said, well, if it's what I think it is, it's rare in boys, it's even rarer in girls. And so we said, okay. Well, we said, well, well, first of all, we said, well, is our child healthy? She said, yes, your child's healthy, but there's just some issues I see that I need to let the doctor know about, and he can explain it to you. And we said, okay. So at that point, we got thrust into seeing a regular OBGYN that we were already seeing and a perinatologist, which is essentially a specialized high risk OBGYN, is what that was. And so for weeks leading up to my wife giving birth, they gave us every diagnosis under the sun. He was born with one kidney. That one kidney was sustaining some damage because it was having fluid back up into it. Like, it doesn't, meters don't sound like it's a big distance, but when you're looking at an ultrasound screen and you see a black just circle about that big on a kidney, on an ultrasound, that's massive.
Whoa.
I mean, it's just, it doesn't sound like it, but the looks, we were just like, well, what's going on? And so for weeks we were going back, and they told us, well, he's only got one kidney, which was true. And then they said, well, he's got areas of missing white matter in his brain. He could have hydrocephalus. And they listed like 5 or 6 different like major issues. And what we've learned through this journey is doctors these days will either not tell you anything as to cover themselves, or they will tell you everything under the sun as to not get sued, is just so they can cover their bases. There's no middle ground. And so, we did this, and then my wife gave birth, and she had a C-section. They brought her over, our son over to us. We saw him for about 30 seconds, and they immediately took him to the NICU at that hospital. My wife, as a lot of women do, she got kind of sick from the epidural and that kind of, so she had to kind of go off into recovery. And so I immediately went up to the end of the NICU. And so at that point, the doctor came in and said, well, your child has a condition called Eagle-Barrett syndrome. And I went, what? He said, it's a rare condition. He says 1 in 40,000 births. He said the easiest way to explain it is it's a condition that is associated with something with the kidneys. They don't officially know what the exact cause of it is, but they do know it's related to the kidneys. And so that's all we really knew before I started researching it. And he goes, as of tomorrow, we're going to call the local children's hospital, which is on the north side of Atlanta, because I'm on kind of the southwest side of Atlanta, Georgia. And they said the transport team's going to come up and get your son and take him up to the NICU up there. And so I said, okay. I said, here's one request I have. I said, my wife barely saw her son earlier today because she wasn't feeling well. I said, you are not about to take my son up there before my wife has had a chance to really see him, even if he's in one of those carriers, incubators that they transport kids in for just a few months. I said, I will have to live with this for the rest of my life. I'm not going to do that. And so he was really nice. And he said, the hospital's really, really good about that. He said, they'll bring him into your wife's room. I said, good. I said, that's all I'm asking. And so they did. They immediately take him up to the children's hospital. Typically in the hospital these days, women are in the hospital for about, unless issues arise, typically about 3 days after a C-section. They want women up like 18 hours afterwards, they want women up, walking, moving, because the faster you get up, the faster you start healing is their justification. And so instead of being there 3 days, my wife was out the door in 2 because of wanting to know what was going on. So he went up to the local children's hospital. He was up there 11 total days. And in those 11 total days, they told us everything under the sun about what his issues were. And, we were kind of getting a picture of what our life was going to be like, about a condition we had never heard about, that honestly, nobody in about 1,000-mile radius knew exactly what we were dealing with at that point, because of not only did he have the rare condition, we later found out that he was epileptic. Uh, he was epileptic. He was severely delayed. He was nonverbal, and he could walk with assistance, but by himself, he had to have a wheelchair. And so in that first 11 days, we went from thinking everything was going to be kind of okay, to getting a full list of things that were going on, to having, at one point, I think we had 6 specialists that we had to see every 6 months. It was a lot. And so from that point, we got kind of, they kind of grabbed, like when I learned how to swim, kind of my father grabbed me in the back, kind of just throwing me in the pool. That's kind of how we got thrown into the special needs world. And it was a lot to handle. Uh, Probably about my 3rd or 4th day in there, I'm sitting here over the crib. My parents are there, and I'm looking at my son, and the head nurse is just chirping things in my ear about everything's going, and I lose it. Like, I just start bawling, because it hits me like a Mack truck. Like, what are we going to do? I don't know how we're going to do this. This isn't what we had planned. This isn't the life that we were expecting. And so, we got kind of thrust into things. Um, so we dealt with that for about 2 years. We decided we were going to have another child, which we later found out was our daughter. And so let me tell you the start of her life. So because my son was a high risk pregnancy, my daughter immediately started seeing a perinatologist. Just as a safety precaution, even though at that point they didn't think there were any issues, they just wanted to be safe. We said, okay, not a problem. We've seen perinatologists before. So we go in there, everything's fine, everything's fine. And then probably about, I think it was 17 or week 18, maybe. No, it was right after, because we had found out the sex of our child. So 20 or 21, we had found out. Perinatologist comes in, look, they go, hmm. And I went, what does mean? I said, because that's never good. And she goes, well, it looks like there's fluid forming on her left lung. And I went, how good or bad is that? She said, well, it's not good. And she goes, the reason why is because it creates pressure and it will make the lung not form correctly. And that's a major issue. And I said, okay, so what's the next step? She said, well, we're going to need to draw fluid out of it. And I said, well, how are you going to go about doing that? Because they wanted to test the fluid to see if they could see if I guess whatever was in it could tell where it was coming from. And I said, so how are you going to do that? She said, we're going to take a needle about that long. I mean, it was massive. And she goes, it's going to have to go in from the outside stomach through the amniotic sac into the child's chest, into the lung to pull fluid out. And I said, how long do we have to make a decision? She goes, well, she said, you've got some time, but she said, sooner is a lot better than later. And I said, can we have a week so we can kind of process this? She said, yes, you can. She said, I don't think anything should happen in a week that shouldn't, be of concern, but sooner rather than later. And she said and so before that, I was caught kind of always anti-amniocentesis, I think is the name, because yes, it can tell possibilities, but it won't give exact it'll say, well, there's a possibility to have that. And so for those that don't know, once you poke that amniotic sac that the child is in, if anything bumps it in the wrong way, it can rupture. She can break her water and she can go into labor at any point after that because you've essentially created a hole in a balloon. And so, we're people of faith and pretty religious. And so we prayed about it and prayed about it and prayed about it. And then I finally just said, you know what? For, as much as I don't want to, I think the best decision is to go ahead and go forth to figure out what's going on. We already have a son that's got a lot of issues. I think it's best if there are issues that we find out beforehand to kind of mentally prepare, because otherwise it's going to hit us like a Mack truck. And my wife was of the same thinking. So we went in the next week and we went down for the ultrasound again. And we see the doctor going over it, and we can see him going back and forth and back and forth, and we can see a puzzled look on his face and back and forth and back and forth. And he goes, huh? He goes, I told you there was fluid on her left lung last week, didn't I? And I said, yeah, you did. And I said, you told us that we were probably going to need to do an amnio and the ridiculous process it was to get to it. And he goes, let me look at my notes. He goes, yep, I remember telling you. He goes, we no longer have to do it. He goes, it is completely gone. He said, there's no recollection of it. There's nothing. He said, so as far as I'm concerned at this point, everything looks normal. We're back to our normal plan. Um, he said, unless something else comes up and subsequent ultrasounds, here you go. And we're like, well, great, wonderful. So when I tell people that I won't get preachy, I promise. But when I tell people that I've had tangible examples of things like this is one of those examples I give people, kind of thing. So we think our daughter's going to be the normal child. Well, we get her tested for physical therapy about 6 months afterwards, and she comes up delayed at that point. And honestly, I didn't react the best way to the physical therapist. I basically told her to pack up her crap and get out of my house because I didn't want to hear it. We went to our pediatrician, and her comment to us was, if you're basing your daughter's development on your son, she's going to look normal, but in reality, she's delayed. I tend to agree with them. She probably needs to see a neurologist. So in the span of about 2.5 years, we found out we had two special needs kids. The list of their issues: my son had the rare condition of Eagle-Barrett syndrome. They both were nonverbal. They both were severely delayed. They were both epileptic. Of the 6 different kinds of seizures, we saw 4 different kinds. They were both in a wheelchair. They both will currently need or did need care for the rest of their lives. So that was the first 2.5 years that we had children.
That is a lot. Where do you usually take the story next from there?
From there, of the two of my children, my son was the more medically needy. Because of his rare condition, he was susceptible to respiratory illnesses. So literally the first 5 years of his life, we were in and out of the hospital ICU every 6 months. We got in there so much that when we would come back in, the nurses would go, hey, Zach, how's it going? And I'd look at him and go, it's great that you know his name, but it's also not great that when I walk in the door, he's been in here so much, you know his name. And I said, but I do appreciate it. So we were in and out of the ICU. I can't tell you how many times because, you know, every time cold and flu season came down, he always either got a bronchitis, an RSV. I don't think he ever got pneumonia. There was one of them he never got, but he got all the other ones. And so we got to a point where I had all of the take-home respiratory machines that they use in the hospital that I can have in my house, I had in his room. So anytime I would hear that cough that I knew that sound to, I started the process. And there were multiple times that the moment I heard it, I rushed him up to the hospital, and that evening he was admitted. And we typically, when we got admitted, we were there at least 7 days every time we were there. And so if we hadn't have had our personal insurance and our state Medicaid at this point, up until he passed away, we would be $6.5 million in the hole. That's how much money we spent over the years. Because every time we were in the ICU, it ran us approximately 90 to $95,000 for about a week. Every time we were in there. And so we would always tell people around us, for those that, would go, well, all these people are scamming the system. Well, I would say, well, here's a positive story. You are helping me, because otherwise we would be in the medical poorhouse if the state of Georgia was not helping us, because it's ridiculously expensive for the amount of care that he needed.
Mm.
So we did that. And my daughter would, every once in a blue moon, would be in and out of the hospital. It was my son that was constantly going to specialists and in the hospital. And it was the reason why I left my profession and became a stay-at-home parent for 12 years up until he passed away,
Mm.
because it was constant.
I'd like to shift gears a little bit to talk about, you know, not saying, oh, this is too sad and doom and gloom, but I
No.
want to hear the happy times that like people were not in the hospital and like the learning their personalities with not being able to talk, but how did they show what they wanted and express joy and
Um, Initially it was difficult for me, but I'm one of those people that when I find something, I'll either get on Facebook and find a group that's related to it, or go online to find a group that's related to it, or I'm big about researching things. So like when I found out he had Eagle Barrett syndrome, the first thing I did was I got online and I found the national organization and became a member of it.
yeah.
I got in Facebook groups that dealt with special needs issues, local and nationally. I did all the, in fact, I did several things. So, you know, typically when a person talks, it's something like 95 or 96% of language is nonverbal cues.
Mm-hmm.
So the words that you're saying is a very small percentage. And so I got to where I started noticing, I'm big about noticing patterns and things that step out of those patterns. And so I tend to pick up on those. And so with my son, that's what I had to learn. Now, my son, when you would ask him something, you go, well, do you want a bath? And he'd go, and make kind of a sound, but he wouldn't say yes. So, or he would clap his hands and get all excited if he wanted to do something. And so he had ways of physically saying it, but to actually say yes or no, no. He did say mama a couple of times.
Oh.
He he never said, even though I was his constant caregiver and for the longest time it tore me up, he never said dad ever. And so as a father, that tore me up for a long time, just to even be able to hear it once. But life didn't have it that way. So we did have ways to communicate. He we found out one time in the hospital that he absolutely loved the Weather Channel. We could leave it on the Weather Channel for hours and he would just be completely content. I don't know if it was the colors because of his sensory issues. I don't know if it was the music. I don't know if it was the people on there, but it was something related to the Weather Channel that he absolutely loved. In fact, one of the times we were in there, my wife and I were there and we said, well, we're going to go down to the cafeteria. We have the Weather Channel on. I know it's on, but he absolutely loves it. Just leave it on there. He'll be completely content till we get back. So we go down, we come back up, and we turn around the corner and we can hear crying. And we're just like, why is that crying? And so we walk in there. And so one of the nurses, unbeknownst to us, turned it on like cartoons, because what kid doesn't want to watch cartoons? She didn't know. And so we walked in there and we go, why is he crying? They go, well, we don't know why. And I turned it back on the Weather Channel and he immediately stopped. And I went down to the nurse desk and they were all down there and I said, look, I said, it's weird. I know. I said, but he absolutely loves the Weather Channel. It's something about it. And so that from that point forward, they were great about it. Well, later on down the road, I've gotten to where I've used social media a lot. Like if I have a comment, either a praise or a negativity for a company, I don't call a company. I'll get on Twitter and I'll tweet something. And typically, most companies have a team that will watch those and they will respond almost immediately. So we're watching the Weather Channel at home one day, and I just get on the Weather Channel, their national website, because I'm on the south side of Atlanta. The Weather Channel that you see produced is based in North Atlanta. And so we're about a 45-minute drive actually from the studios there. So I get on the Weather Channel on Twitter and I tweet him. I go, just let you know, you just don't know. My son's got medical needs. He really loves your channel. Thank you for what you're doing outside, showing the weather. And about 5 minutes later, I get this gentleman comment back to me. He said, "Thank you." He said, "You'd be amazed at how many times we hear that. We love that we can, help the kids and all that with our channel." And he goes, "If there's anything you need, just let me know." And I said, "Well, I'm on the south side of Atlanta." I said, "Aren't y'all based on the north side of Atlanta?" He said, "Yeah, our studios are up, for those in Atlanta, it's kind of the Cobb County area." And I said, "Well, do you guys do tours?" And he said, "Oh, sure we do." And I said, "Well, my son loves it." I said, "I think he would really like to do that." And he said, "Well, direct message me your information and your email." And he said, "I'll get that going so y'all can get credentials and you can set up a time." I said, "Great." Well, I went back to research the guy who messaged me just to make sure it wasn't a scam, that kind of thing. Turns out it was the president of the Weather Channel at that point in time that had messaged me directly. And I was just dumbfounded. So, we had that, and my son was definitely a ladies' man. He loved women of all shapes, sizes, colors, you name it. In fact, his hierarchy of hair color is or was blonde, brunette, brown, black, redhead is how he went. If you had blonde hair, he was like a moth to a flame. He would want to go over, he'd put his hands out wanting to give you a hug, and I'd look at him and go, "Son, I know what you're doing." And so he loved women, even as young as he was. Uh, he he loved school. He absolutely loved riding the bus. He every time the bus he would essentially lose his mind every time the bus lift would come and lower down and he would get on the bus. And so he was a people watcher. I tell people all the time he did not know a stranger. Period. He it did not. He was in a good and maybe a bad way. He was very trusting
Mm.
to whoever was around him. So he loved to swim just because we could put him in kind of a tube contraction to where he could float, and you could just see his body language change because of the freedom that he had since he couldn't walk on his own, and the fact that he could do that and move around in a pool and float. uh, we would go over to the in-laws house and he would be in there for 4 and 5 hour stretches. He would do it until his teeth would chatter. So
Oh,
yeah, I mean, he despite all of the issues we had and hospital stays, he loved life.
oh. It's so beautiful to hear that. It's so powerful to keep people's memories alive, and it wasn't just hospital visits and suffering. There was
Hmm.
so much good to look back on.
Hmm.
And the thing with special needs people is with such as him is like they remind us like, oh yeah, I can be joyful about normal things.
Hmm.
I don't only have to be joyful about the special vacation, like
Hmm.
the bus. What if we got that excited about the bus every time we saw
Oh yeah, the
it?
even his sister's that way.
So was it a was it a sudden thing when he passed?
Yeah, so several years back the world went through COVID,
Yep,
and I was probably on high stress for 2 years
I can
because he
imagine.
was he had respiratory related susceptibility, and the world was facing a respiratory related illness that nobody knew anything about. And so we made it through the first year with nothing. And right after the first year, unbeknownst to me, someone had passed it to me and
Oh,
I brought it into the house.
oh,
So about 3 days before I realized I had really bad headaches. And I was just, man, I've never had headaches this bad. And during that time, I was literally 6 inches from him the whole time. And so the day I realized I thought I might have it was went to go make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and I went to go smell the peanut butter just because the symptom was you lost sense of taste and smell. And I went to go do that, and I went, oh no, I immediately knew. So at that point in time, at least in the States, you had to do a teledoc appointment for them to kind of assess, and then if they felt like you might have it, they actually did drive-through testing. They would set things out in the parking lot. They'd do the swab. They'd tell you to go park. And they would say, it takes about 10 minutes. We'll come and let you know. And then we went through all the protocol at the time. And I told them, they said, well, we can do the fast or the slow. And I told him, I said, well, here's my situation at home. Can I do both? And he said, sure, you can do both. I said, I'm assuming if I have it through the fast, I'm going to have it through the long one as well. Well, I went to go do that. And she said, it isn't going to take about 10 minutes. She walked back about 5 minutes later. She goes, yeah, you have COVID. Well, the weird thing about COVID in my house, if my son got it, he never showed a single symptom,
wow.
period. My son never got it. My wife never got it. My daughter got it, but she never showed a symptom ever. Not a fever, nothing. In fact, if I hadn't have gotten her tested, I would have never known that she had it. And in fact, as fast as it came, it literally came in one day and a week to the day it left. And I never caught it again. And so, we had that, but we get through all that. And my son, throughout his life, from time to time, had 24-hour bugs that he would get. I never thought anything about it. So, about 3 days prior, he came home. We fixed him one of his favorite meals, and even though he looked like he never ate, he ate like a horse. He just couldn't keep weight on him. And so he ate his favorite meal, didn't think anything about it. And typically, what we would do is we'd put our daughter to bed first, and we'd give our son a little more one-on-one time with my wife and I, just because, let's face it, my girl can be a lot to handle at times, just with the drama that she produces. And so we brought him into our bedroom to kind of watch TV with him and goof off with him. Well, my wife went to go brush his teeth with the electric toothbrush we had from him, and he gagged a little bit and threw up. And we thought, well, maybe we went a little too far back, just his gag reflex, and he threw up a little bit. Didn't think anything about it. Cleaned him up, kept him up for a little while longer, put him to bed. Well, he was up and down all night that night. We weren't sure why. And so I was staying at home at that point, and I said I'm gonna keep him home because we were kind of inching up on a holiday. So if I kept him out the next 2 days, and we were just gonna butt into a holiday, and we wouldn't have to worry about missing any more school. And so the next day we got him up and we kept him home from school, and I put him in like his chair, and I kept telling him all day, buddy, you can take a nap. I know you're exhausted. And he absolutely refused. And I'm just like, buddy, you're not missing anything. I said, I'm going to be sitting on the couch just making sure you're okay. And so he refused. And so that next night, instead of keeping him up, we put him to bed at the same time as my daughter. I said, I'm going to give him a little more time to sleep. And I looked at my wife. I said, I'm going to keep him home again tomorrow, which was the next day, that first day it was Wednesday night into Thursday. I kept him home Thursday, said, I'm going to keep him home Friday as well. Went almost immediately got quiet, didn't think anything about it, thought he was just exhausted. He fell asleep. Next morning, we get our daughter up, get her to school. We give him about 8:30, 9 o'clock. We walk into his room and he's up. And I look at him and I notice out of the right side of his mouth, I see this green streak, dark green streak. And what little medical knowledge I have, I go, the only thing in your body that's dark green is bile. Why is bile coming out of his mouth? And so I get him up, and he's really floppy, like he can't hold himself up, kind of thing. And that didn't really strike me because a couple of times when he got really sick, that had happened. So I thought, well, he's not really feeling well. I said, let me get him out. I got him out in the living room, put him on the floor. Because of his rare condition, from time to time, I would have to give him a catheter to release pressure in his bladder. And so I thought, well, let me do that just to make sure that's not part of the issue. Well, I got very minimal, like urine out, that kind of thing. But the one thing that struck me was his intestinal area was like rock hard, like cement rock hard. And that struck me as odd. And so I thought, that's unusual. And it was honestly just a gut feeling. I went, you know what? I'm going to take him up to the hospital. I said, something's not right. And I don't know what it is. I said, something's off. And it's been my gut that saved his life a couple of times before. So I was just like, I'm just going, if worse comes to worse, we get admitted. He's there for a couple of days. At least he's there with medical professionals versus at the house. So I get him dressed, I get him in his chair, I get him in the van, and I do like 90 up there because the children's hospital for me is about 60 miles, which for a lot of people may go, wow, that's a long distance. But with Atlanta being 125 miles across, 60 miles is nothing. I mean, for those of us that live here, driving 30 to 45 minutes just to get somewhere, we don't think twice about it. And so I'm doing about 90 getting to Atlanta. So I get on the north side of Atlanta, and right before the exit to get off the Georgia route that I need to get to, on the sign I see exit for Georgia 400, all lanes blocked. And I go, oh my God. And so where I get slowed down is probably about 500 yards from the exit, and I'm just inching along at this point. And throughout this whole time, I'm snapping my fingers at my son because he looks like he's fading in and out, like someone who gets a concussion, you don't want him to fall asleep. That's kind of my thinking at this point. I'm just like, buddy, stay with me, stay with me, stay with me. I don't know what's going on, just stay with me. And in my head, I'm freaking out at this point because I don't know what's going on, and it looks like it's getting serious to me. And so I finally get up to the front, and I don't know if they were going to let us go, but whatever the road crew was there was doing something. It looked like they were finishing up, and I just floor it. And I can see him yelling at me like I wasn't supposed to go, but he didn't know what was going on in my van at that point. So I fly up to the children's hospital. I park in there. I get him out of the van to put him in his wheelchair, and he's really floppy at this point. And I'm just like, this is really not good. My intuition is kind of pinging, and I'm kind of compartmentalizing at this point, and I rush him up in the ER. And so there's a line that you got to go through, and I skip the line, and I'm about to go to the desk, and the security guard walks up to me as if to say, didn't you see the line there? And before he can say anything, I look at him and go, I don't think he's breathing. I need someone right now. And he snaps his fingers at the nurse, and she goes, come with me. And we literally run back to an ER trauma room. So we go into that room, and because I've been in the hospital so many times, I instinctually take him out of his chair. I put him on the gurney over there, and I back out of the way in hopes that they'll let me stay in there because he's nonverbal and I can tell them what's going on, whereas he cannot. And it just so happens connected to it's another ER trauma room that's not in use. And so I back off into there and let them come in. Well, the moment they get in there, like ants at an anthill, when you step on it, like 30 people all come in and just swarm him. And I'm backed off, and so they immediately cut off his clothes. They immediately start CPR on him, and I don't know what they did, but I'll never forget it. This one guy I don't know if he put a port in him or what, but he drills something into his knee, like to hook something up. And to a normal person, you would have come off the table. It would have been so painful, and he didn't even flinch. So they do something to, I guess, to help get something in them to help them out with whatever they're thinking it is at that point. And I'm backed off and I'm watching this. And to this day, I can look at the gurney and I can see The two nurses over here on the computer, they're taking notes about what's going on. The two nurses, one male, one sitting on top of my son doing CPR on him. The other one's barking out something to him, like either number of compressions or something like that. The two over here doing something, getting medication, and there's two over here doing something else. So even though it looks like chaos, it's kind of coordinated chaos. And so I'm sitting back, and the head ER doc walks over to me and goes, to the best of your knowledge, to the minute, how long has he been this way? I said, I came up from Coweta County. I said, it took me 45 minutes to come up here. I said, it took me about 5 minutes to get in here. I said, he's been this way since about halfway up. So I'm going to say about 15 to 20 minutes, give or take 2 or 3 minutes. She goes, okay. She walks back in there and starts barking out orders to them. And that you can see them kind of go in their motions. And she comes back to me and she goes, explain to me why you brought him up here. And I told her everything that went on. I said, I have a lot of medical knowledge as it relates to his respiratory. As I said, but this is out of my wheelhouse. I don't know what's going on. And she goes, okay. And so she goes back out and starts barking orders, like kind of change orders to him what they need to do. And, they're from the time he walks in there, they're continuously doing CPR on him. At this point, it had been 30 continuous minutes that they're doing it. And so at about 30 minutes in it, it used to be the old days, the paddles that they would kind of bring you back to life, or they put the lube on it and they do this and they do clear. Well, now it's kind of pads they put to you and they tell everybody to step back. And so they do that, and I hear clear, and I can hear it shock, and literally like on TV, he raises off the table and goes back down. I have looked at those oxygen monitors 1,000 times because of all of his respiratory related illnesses. And I look at his respiratory rate and it goes boop and goes right back to normal, what it was. And at that point, even though it doesn't hit me, and even though they shock him probably 4 more times in this process, after that initial one in my head, I go, he's not coming back. I said, I have a gut feeling he's not coming back. And so they continue for about 15 more minutes, and she comes over to me and she goes, we can shock him again, but she goes, I don't think it'll do anything. And I said, this is out of my wheelhouse. Do what you think is professionally necessary. And so they do. Nothing happens. It's still at that point flatlining. And so she pronounces them, and I understandably I walk over and have a minute just to kind of regain my composure of just everything going on. My wife was at home working. I call my wife. She understandably loses it. I said, call your parents, have them come break you up. I don't want you driving up here. And so she does. I call my parents because they watched him when he was younger. She understandably just loses it. And so they don't come up at that point. And so after I do that, the care team comes in and she goes, we don't need this room. You can spend as much time as you need in here until your wife gets in here with your son. It's completely okay. There's no rush. And I said, okay. And so I've learned to compartmentalize throughout all these years of special needs stuff, just because there have been times before all this, I've had to make split-second decisions to help save his life. And so I don't need to be, at that point, I'm just like, I don't need to be bogged down with this. I will deal with this later. And so the head of the people that deal with, after someone passes away, walks over to me, and I look right at her and I go, this is going to sound cold and callous, and I don't mean it to be. I said, but I'm a very information ADD driven person. And I said, there's some things I need to know right now. And she goes, what is that? I said, what happens from this point? Does he go to the morgue? Do I have to call a funeral home? If he goes to the morgue, I said, is the coroner doing an autopsy? If so, how long is that process? When will I find out the results? If he doesn't do an autopsy, I said, why will he do an autopsy or not do an autopsy? I said, once all that's done, I said, when I get a hold of a funeral home, what's the process I can get him from here to the funeral home to get him home per se? And I list off like 8 more things. She literally said, I'll never forget it. I can laugh now about it, but she literally takes a step back and her jaw just drops. And she goes, well, she said, the first step is going to be I'm going to talk to the coroner and he will make a decision as to whether he's going to do an autopsy or not. I said, okay, great. Let me know. Well, she comes back about 5 minutes later and she goes, the coroner has decided he is not going to do an autopsy. And I didn't mean for it to be harsh, but it was in the moment. I go, why? Why is he not going to do an autopsy? I said, I want to know his explanation in the protocol as to why he's not going to do an autopsy on my son. And she takes a step back again and she goes, typically in a children's hospital, the only reason why they do an autopsy if it's abuse related, criminally related, or drug related. She said, or if they were completely healthy and all of a sudden something happened and they died. She said, because your son had such the extensive history at this hospital, he's just going to relate it to something related to his special needs. And I said, okay, I'm okay with that. Now, later on down the road, I told my wife, I said, even if they had done it, would we have actually found out what happened? Maybe or maybe not. I said, but everything I've heard from people that have had it done, I said, instead of getting our son back 2 or 3 days later, it could have been months. And I said, just from backup and just the process. And I said, then we would have had to wait months to either bury or cremate him. And I said, honestly, I would have rather done it this way. And we knew he had issues, that kind of thing. So the official diagnosis was sepsis and cardiac arrest due to sepsis. Uh, the ER doc said, she said, I asked her, I said, is there any way that you could pinpoint where it came from? And she goes, no. She said, right now there's about 100 spots that I could say that it could come from that wouldn't be official. And she said, there's no way to officially tell. However, I'm one of those people that I picked up on different things. And based on the wording I heard that day, and like I requested the ER notes and I went back and with a fine tooth comb and looked over them. And based on the symptoms I found that morning and what they said in there, I 100% believe he had contracted gastroenteritis and went too far. It caused an infection and he got sepsis because of it. And by the time I caught it, it was too late. I later found out that even in the hospital, sepsis, if they don't catch it early on, has like a 95% fatality rate. It's something ridiculous. And so we had all that. So I'm waiting there with my son. And the last thing I'll say about at least that part is the care team comes in and she goes, I just want you to know, she said, I can walk into a room and without ever talking to the parent, tell how well the child is taken care of. And she said, he looks like he was very well taken care of. And I said, that makes me feel better. I said, it's going to sound crazy. I said, but in today's visual world, he looks like he's almost emaciated, like I don't feed him. And I said, even though he ate like a horse, I said, the fact that Children's Healthcare of Atlanta backs me up on how I took care of him so that there wouldn't be any legal issues later on down the road, I said, makes me feel better. I said, you know I did. I know I did. But someone looking at him may go, well, you didn't take care of him. I said, you have no idea what I did to take care of him. So I will say the hardest thing in this whole journey that I ever had to do was my wife came up. We had spent our time with him. We decided to leave, and I had to roll his empty wheelchair with all of his cut up clothing on through that hospital back into the van. And we had to drive 60 miles home quiet to our house. That was the hardest 60 miles I've ever driven. And now everything else was kind of difficult, but yeah. So that's kind of how the whole grief thing started.
I mean, it's so, what, there's nothing to say. Like, I'm sorry for your loss.
Mhm.
There's just no words.
Uh,
There isn't any words for, like, nobody can. I've experienced an early miscarriage, so I'm not
mhm.
comparing them in the slightest. But
Oh no.
I was in South Africa where people are much more open spiritually to say things like not in Sweden. So I heard
Mhm.
the whole gamut of it's God's will, it's the devil, it's you
Mhm.
can have more kids, blah blah blah. So you just know people say some dumb things sometimes.
Well, on the religious side, and I won't get preachy about it. On the religious side, from my point of view, I 100% that we are all here for a purpose. There's, even though we may not know it, we all kind of have a checklist of things that we are here meant to do. We won't know we're done with it until that day we're called home, is what I 100% believe. And I believe that whatever he was meant to do and what it would then encourage to push me into doing was accomplished.
Mm.
And so, do I believe one day down the road that we will reunite in heaven and we'll have a conversation that we've never had? 100% I do. You know, for those that are listening and watching, take it with whatever you believe. But that's my belief of that whole process. As much as I want him here and long for him to be here, he has pushed me into an arena that I never thought possible, that in the first 6 months has just blown up and continues to blow up based on kind of my style of doing things. And it is only getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So, as much as I want him here, what his passing has done has created what I consider to be a massive legacy for him, and it's only getting bigger,
Mm.
is what I believe with it.
Well, I'd love to go from there. How was his passing a catalyst for you finding your purpose right now?
Well, I will say before all this happened, I was in therapy for a while for some issues I was dealing with. As I've always said, I'm very open and honest. Initially, when we got into the special needs life, I dealt with typically the first issue a lot of men deal with is anger. It's just that's how we're programmed. A lot of us are hotheads. I'm one of them. Um, and so I dealt with a lot of anger, not necessarily towards anyone per se, just it was more, well, this is how my life was supposed to have been. This is how it is. You know, as you can see through this and what you've read on my writing and all that, I can run my mouth. And so I can talk, I could talk to a wall if I needed to. And so I could talk and write, but yet I had a son that couldn't talk. And so that was the first kind of oxymoron, if you will. Um, I was very sports minded. I taught physical education for 9 years. My son could not play any sports. And so there are a lot of very big oxymoronic kind of things or paradoxical things, if you will, that happened that I was just like, this is not how it's supposed to be. And then on top of it, you had my daughter who had a lot of the similar issues. And so I was seeing a therapist for just dealing with those issues, trying to get past them. Well, in the midst of all this, my son passed away, and as you can imagine, at the point in which my son had passed away, I had gotten over the hump dealing with previous issues and was doing well for a while. And then I felt like it was just coming back with a vengeance. You know, I just gotten over there. I was doing well, and my wife said I was doing better and all these wonderful things. And I just felt like I got knocked over with all of the emotions dealing with losing a child. So at one point, I think it was both my wife and the therapist had said, "Well, have you ever considered writing or journaling?" And I went, I don't know. I don't know if I'm a real big journaler or writer. If you went based on the first principal I ever had, because I had to send out correspondence, she absolutely hated my writing. She hated it with a passion. Like every time I would submit something to be reviewed, it would come back blood red because she hated it so much, and which is irony now. So I initially started it for myself. Excuse me for a second. And I have, let's see, well, you can't see it, but this is my journal. It's a 2-inch binder of stuff I've written over the last 2+ years. And so I started writing it for myself, and I got into a Facebook group on grief, and I got to know that it was a smaller group, so I got to know the admin real well. And at one point she goes, "Would you like to moderate it for me?" And I said, "Yeah, I don't mind." I said, "But I don't want to admin it just because I've done that in the past." And I said, "It's just dealing with a bunch of whiny adults, and I'd rather not deal with that aspect of it." And she goes, "Fine, you won't have to admin it." And so I did that for a while, and it just got to be too much. And so one day I said, "Well, first of all, in most grief groups online, typically there's about 1 to 2% that are men in those groups, and of that 1 to 2%, probably about 0.5% actually react and post on a regular basis." So when I was in there all the time reacting, I've been kind of the unicorn or the token male in there in a lot of these groups because I have no problem voicing my thoughts. And so one day I said, "Do you mind?" I said, I journal. I said, "Do you mind if I post one of my journal entries?" She goes, "No, go for it." And so I did. And almost immediately I got a massive response. And so I've never been one to promote myself in the sense to say I'm greater than anything else. I've always had a hard time about it. Although in doing the things that I'm doing now, you kind of have to kind of get the word out there. And so but the first response I got from the very first post, because it was a really raw post, was I had a mother that said, "You are the first person to write exactly what I'm feeling, the first one ever." And I said, "Well, I'm glad that my words can help you and that you can relate to what I'm saying." I said, "These words are kind of inspired by my son." And so I posted more and more. And so I had one lady said, "This speaks to my soul." This, very complimentary things. And so it went on for a while. And uh, someone said, "Well, have you ever thought about writing a book?" I said, "Yeah, I don't know if I'm going to." I said, I don't, I said, "When I write in the moment. That's the reason why it comes out the way it does. I don't know how well I'll do with deadlines." And so someone then said, "Well, write the way you do, compile a lot of it." And it said, "At some point you'll have enough material that if you wanted to submit it, you could." Well, I have enough material now, although I haven't decided if I'm going to do it or not. I probably will at some point, but at this point, I'm trying to get the online stuff going. So someone said, "Well, instead of doing that, have you ever thought about doing like a Facebook blog?" And I said, I said, "Well, I might do that." And so when I initially did it a little over 6 months ago, when I started, I had probably 10 or 12 followers, kind of the standard of what a lot of these pages start at. And I wasn't getting a whole lot of traction. So I started reaching out to some of what I would consider the bigger names in grief. And I just said, "Hey, my name is so and so. I've got this page going. I'm just starting. If you've got any, tips or words of advice to kind of help me out, let me know." I said, "Because I'd really like to get this off the ground." And I had one or two really big names go, "Well, sure, try X, Y, and Z, do this to open up your audience, if you're going to write a book, do this." And so I did this and I just got my name out there. And so out of the blue, the first grief group I ever got into, the admin there introduced my name to a lady that did a podcast, first podcast I ever did. Out of the blue, she messaged me. She said, "So and so got a hold of me. She said you'd be good for the podcast. Would you like to come on?" Sure. Well, ever since I did that, the first podcast I ever did, that woman, I don't. I'm blown away at the number of contacts she has because since then things have just blown up. Like in 6 months of this page, I'm now at over 850 followers. I've got representation in 19 countries and 44 states. I mean, to a big name, that may be nothing, but to me, in 6 months to have getting upwards of 900 followers, I still can't fathom it. And so, I keep going because of the comments I receive from what I'm posting. Honestly, if the writing was not there and it wasn't what people perceived as good writing, I wouldn't be anywhere near where I am. We probably would not be talking.
Mm.
And so it's the material that creates the foundation that builds the house that is the blog that it is.
Yeah.
And so I have to have that foundation. And so, my biggest concern initially was, will I have enough material to consistently post?
Mm.
And so that was my concern in the beginning. But as of lately, it just seems like it's insatiable for me. I can't stop posting,
Mm.
which is great because in the social media world, the moment you stop posting, it out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah, really. I wanted
So,
to, one of the things that you'd said that was important to you in your posting was reaching out to men in their grief, because men have, there's such a stigma attached. Men don't cry, blah, blah,
yep.
blah. Suck it up, rub some dirt in it.
Mhm.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on that and, breaking that down that men feel as much as anyone else does in a
The
safe
initial
and
reason
healthy way.
why the initial reason why I created the page is because I wanted specifically men. Because as I told you before, typically in a group, there's 2%, and of that 2%, maybe 5.5% will post occasionally, and even less than that post on a regular basis. And so it wasn't anything against the groups. It was more my frustration was I have no problem talking to mothers and wives and all that. I've done it all my life. I have no problem with that. But I wanted people that I could talk to that were like minded, that were men, that were willing to talk about it. And so it was more my frustration and maybe even spite is the reason why I decided to create the page, because I was just like, there needs to be an outlet. And so I have gotten into a lot of online arguments with women about some of the points I'm about to point out. I said, when I got to be kind of at a certain status on this page, I would have mothers and wives come out and say, well, why is my husband not talking? He's always quiet. And I said, well, I'm going to tell you, I said, but I'm going to be blunt about it. And I said, you may not like what I have to tell you. I said, I've been a man all my life. It's the best thing I know about. I said, so I get it. I said, men are trained from birth that no matter what we feel or how we feel, it is always secondary to the woman. Always. I said, we're trained that from the beginning. We're trained to hold it down, to suck it up, to walk it off, tape it up and walk it off, rub dirt on it and walk it off, you name it. In fact, I can guarantee you probably a lot of your listeners have a sign in their house that says, happy wife, happy life. That right there explains my point to a T, because it puts, and there's nothing wrong with going back and forth, putting one over the other in whatever situation in life. But as a general rule, we're taught that you have to make the woman happy. I'm not saying to not make her happy, but it comes before everything. And we're also subconsciously taught that no matter how we feel, it is always secondary to what the woman feels, because traditionally, and women are more emotional, men are more kind of hardcore, if you will, when it comes to that stuff. And so I'm not saying that women can't have emotions, but what I am saying is you have to give us a little more outlet. The second thing I try to tell women is, if a man comes up to you and it feels it's important enough to tell you something that's emotional to him, listen to it. I said, if your response to him is, you're telling me that, or I can't believe you think that, or something along those lines, I said, men will give you probably 2 or 3 chances. If
Hmm.
you continue to do that, they're going to get to a point, probably the second or third chance, and they are not going to talk. As unfortunate as it may be, men have learned, I'm going to give you 1 or 2 chances, and if I get burned, I'm done with it. I will move on. It's just how a lot of men are programmed. And so,
Can I
I,
ask a question real
what's
quick?
that?
In that, um, how do you how do you encourage, like, yes, validate absolutely when the chance comes, but before the chance comes, when they're in their grief, how do you give a man an outlet so that he can say what's really on his mind?
you have to give him a feeling of, I hate to use the catchphrase lately, but a safe space. You have to give him somewhere where he believes that he can be vulnerable and not have it thrown back at him. Because men have learned out throughout history. It's the old adage that something happens and a man and a woman get into a fight, and a woman will recall something 5 years later at 10:30 at night on this day when the weather was this outside. And so men have learned that. And so, yeah, I get that we all have our ups and downs, but I have heard from several men online that have said, I don't want to be vulnerable to someone and have it when we get into an argument, have it thrown back in my face as something to try to cut me per se.
Mm.
And so women have to somehow create an environment where they can be vulnerable in front of them and not feel chastised, looked down upon, weak. Even when it comes to dating, I hear so many women that say, well, I want a man who can open up about his emotions. Well, sure, that sounds great on paper and on Tinder. However, the moment you get it, a lot of you women out there chastise it as weakness, or he's too emotional, or he's too this. You can't have it both ways. I get there are extremes, and yeah, I understand that. But most men, when they're emotional, they're not going to cry on your shoulder, but they will tell you what they're feeling. And so I don't have a simple answer, but there needs to be an area where the man feels like he can be vulnerable without feeling like it's going to get thrown back at him.
That makes sense. Do you think that the fact that you're a words guy, that you've always connected to words, has been a pretty big, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not all guys have that. Not all guys are
Mhm.
so in tune with their words and with their thoughts as you are. So you have the advantage. Do you think that was a pretty big advantage of yours?
Um, I I will tell people that I have always been to notice things that are out of the ordinary, and I just keep those in the back of my head. For example, there's a scene in the movie The Shawshank Redemption where Andy Dufresne, played by Tim Robbins, comes back into the prison and he's wearing the shine shoes of the warden and nobody pays attention. And the quote is something to the effect of nobody ever looks down and pays attention to the shoes because we're so directed to look at different things. And I'm really paraphrasing that quote, and people that have seen the movie will know what I'm talking about. But ever since that quote, when I meet people or in person, for some reason, I always catch myself just ever briefly looking down at their feet. Because it's something that most people don't look at. And I listen for words and phrases that if I need to respond, that I pick up on those specific words and phrases. And as of the other day, I'm big on using analogies, and I constantly get people going, you just have the greatest analogies to explain exactly what I'm thinking or feeling, or as it relates to the picture post that I'm writing a commentary to. Because I feel like if I can put it in layman's terms with a simple analogy, then someone else can understand it that much better.
Mm.
And so it's like one of the posts I did the other day talking about grief and how it never goes away. I said, grief is kind of like when you go to the beach and you go into the ocean or you sit in the sand, and for days and weeks or maybe even months later, you still find sand coming out of places in your car, maybe spots on your body, that kind of, you can't, it's always coming out somewhere. And so I said, grief is the same way. But the difference with grief is, instead of being days, weeks, and months, you continually find sand years down the road. And the other big thing is, whereas you get from the beach and eventually you will get rid of it, with grief, you will always find sand for the rest of your life. And so someone said, wow, that's a really good analogy based on, and I forget the picture post I had, but it's analogies like that I do that I feel like if I can do something simple, and explain it almost like a kindergartner, more people will understand it.
Mm. Well, I think it's really, really wonderful that you're following that call to reach out to people and to connect with them through your words. And I want to be sure that people can reach you and
Okay.
follow you. So you can give me all of your links and I will put them in the description or show notes on Spotify.
Okay. Certainly.
Yeah. Is there any last thing that you would like to say, any encouragement to people out there dealing with their own grief or seeing other people grieve and not knowing how to support them?
Yeah, I'll say two things.
Mm-hmm.
Grief is difficult. Grief is hard. It sucks. Nobody wants to deal with it. People aren't going to understand you. Most people won't know what to say. Um, they will give you some societal platitude that they've learned all their life to say to you. And there's nothing against that. Most people don't want to have to deal with it till they're forced to. I mean, that ultimately, as much as those of us dealing with it don't want to accept that, that's what it is. Grief is like going into a dark tunnel and seeing a light at the end of the tunnel. Initially, it may be a freight train coming your way, is the light. But what you'll find out is you will eventually see the light on the other side of the tunnel. Will you go through more tunnels? Yes, you will. Will you get through the other side of the tunnel? Yes, you will. Will it still hurt at times? Yes, it does. It will never go away. But you'll get through it. Initially, the first tunnel may be a very long tunnel, but eventually the tunnels will get shorter to a point, is what'll happen. And the last thing I'll say is directed specifically to men is the thing that baffles my mind about men and online or maybe even in person is typically the male gender is a gender that never likes being told what to do. And so it baffles my mind that they get online or in person and the society or their family or maybe even their wives tell them what they should and should not do as it relates to their grief. If you're so anti-establishment telling you what to do, why are you allowing them to tell you how you should grieve and how you should feel, especially online? And I will say, like I've said in several other places, do you know how many stupid comments there are online? And I said, so if you post something online, who cares what someone else thinks, especially if it's anti what you're thinking? I said, if it's a stupid comment, as I would do, block and move on.
Yeah.
I said, because they're not dealing with what you're dealing with. So I would just say, keep going. There are people out there that understand you. I understand you. There's several other men I know that understand you that are kind of in this arena. I'm always open to listen to anybody. I'm generally within about a 5 minute response time, almost most of the day. So I welcome anybody.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank
Uh,
you.
the way that I end my conversations is I give hugs. So you can join in if you want, but I'm hugging you in spirit and
Thank you.
hugs to the
Well,
listeners out there that are dealing with grief, dealing with loss, and rebuilding their lives around it. You are seen and you are loved, and like Jason said, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. So don't give up.
certainly.
Bye. Thank you so much for listening. If this resonated with you, definitely check out the links that are going to be down in the description or the show notes where you can connect with Jason. You can read some of his letters to Zach and get plugged into a grief community if you don't already have one. I also have a vlog, and if you'd like to check that out, you can find the links to that also in the description, or if you hang around the channel, you can see them there. And I have a channel for people who want to do podcasting and vlogging themselves. I have a channel that's about giving inspiration and sharing the things that I've learned in that process. So if you're interested, you can check that out as well. I'm so glad you're still here. Please like this video, share it with a friend, and be sure to subscribe. Bye!